位来宾，大家下午好. 여러분, 안녕하십니까? Hi everyone, good afternoon. Wait, so where is this guy from? 어디에서 왔지? 他是哪里人? So, who am I? Where am I from? I've lived in 9 different countries, and I get asked this question all the time. But I actually want to flip the question to you. When you see the way that I look, and you see the way that I move, and you hear the way that I speak, what comes up for you? Where do you think I'm from? So regardless of what the truth is, you have your own ideas. You have your own feeling about where I might be from. Why do I speak Chinese and Korean? Why do I speak English? And how you feel towards me really depends on your native language. We call that a mother tongue. What is the language that makes you feel comfortable, confident, reminds you of home? So we're in Qingdao, so let's imagine that your first language is Chinese. And when I speak Chinese, you might guess that, oh, I can have a conversation with this person. I know something about them. We probably have something in common. And there's a little bit of trust there. And if you're really listening carefully, you'll hear that my accent gives me away. I'm not actually Chinese. And then maybe your second language is English, which I'm using now. And maybe this language is not a language that makes you feel comfortable or confident. Maybe I'm speaking too quickly. Maybe you're worried I'm going to ask you a question and make you speak English. So there might be some anxiety there. And then finally, Korean. I would be surprised if you understand Korean. Maybe some of you watch enough K-pop and Korean dramas. Maybe you know a little bit. But that's the language that I grew up speaking. And it's an interesting situation for you as students of an international British school. You're forced to learn 2 languages. You're going to be eventually sent off into the world to live in a new country. And that's going to be a challenging experience. So I've done that at least 9 times. I've studied at 20 different schools, and a lot of that was my own choice. And a lot of that was really painful. A lot of it was awkwardness and misunderstandings. And so today I want to share with you what I've learned through that journey and see if that might help explain how do you move from the awkward beginnings of learning a new language to eventually feeling comfortable and calm in that language. And one of my favorite quotes is by the former Holy Roman Emperor. It's about 1,000 years old. And the quote goes, "To have a second language is to possess a second soul." And I think that's the goal of learning a language, right? We all hope that if we have our children learn Chinese, learn English, go off into the world, that they get to explore a totally new culture. They get to meet new people. They get exposed to ideas that you would never get exposed to by growing up in your hometown. And the tragedy is that not everybody gets there. I'm sure we all know people who have studied a language for 10 years, 20 years even. They've lived in another country and still don't quite make it. They still feel uncomfortable. They still don't get fluent. And that's the norm for a reason, because learning a language is so difficult. You think about our students here preparing for exams. They're nervous to make a mistake. And when you're feeling nervous, you're going to be scared to speak. And if you're scared to speak, how could you possibly get enough practice to get that mastery that we're looking for? So this is the great paradox. We all want to be able to learn a second language. We all know it takes hard work and study. And yet, so few of us get to that point. And I've tried and tried again. Throughout my life, I've failed and failed. But it is possible. It is possible to gain that second soul. So for me, I grew up in America. I was born in the US, and my first language was Korean. My parents are immigrants from Korea. I would speak Korean at home. And then I remember my mom would pack me this lunch. I guess in Chinese it would be called 小鱼饭. It's basically rice with little pieces of fish. It was my favorite food as a kid. And when I was 6 years old, sat down, my American classmate sat down next to me and asked me, "Hey, so where are you from?" And I said, "Oh, I'm from New Jersey. I was born here." And he said, no, where are you really from? And I said, oh, okay, so my parents are from Korea. And then he asked me, so where in China is Korea? And, I wish I could go back and I wish I could laugh at it. I wish I could say, Korea is actually its own country, but it's right next to China. I wish I could explain that calmly and just be a simple misunderstanding. But of course, I was 6. And what do 6-year-olds do? They feel embarrassed. They get shy. And so I kind of decided at that point, you know what? I'm not Korean. I'm going to be American. I'm going to make sure everybody knows that I belong here. I can fit in. And so what did I do? I went home and I told my mom, stop packing me rice. Give me sandwiches. The beautiful American food. And I just ate sandwiches until I got to high school. And that was a really important moment for me. Just like all of you, I went to a boarding school. And at that boarding school was my first time meeting international students. So these are students who are the top students from China and Korea, all over the world, coming to this small boarding school in New England. And when I met those students, I thought, wow, I actually have a lot in common with you. There was something cultural in common. And I felt inspired. Maybe I should spend more time in Korea. Maybe I can start to learn something about my culture. I don't have to feel shame. I can start learning. And I decided to ask my dad, do you know anybody I could live with in Korea? And so he put me in touch with his middle school classmate. They hadn't spoken in many years, but he asked her, hey, can you take care of my son for a couple months? And I went off and lived in Korea. And it was amazing. I bought a bunch of books. I started memorizing words, going to classes. And there was one day I was bringing home lunch, probably another box of rice, and I was stopped at the front desk, the security guard, the baoan. And he said, hey, where are you from? And I thought I was ready for this question. I prepared. So I said, okay, I am Korean American. I was born in America, and I'm learning Korean in Korea. I had a big smile on my face. And the security guard stopped. He was really confused. He said, no, where are you bringing your food from? And where are you delivering it to? Because he thought I was a delivery guy. He thought I was ulama. And that really crushed my confidence. I had worked really hard to start learning this language, and he looked at me and he saw I was Korean, and yet we still had this language barrier. And it wasn't about the words I used, it wasn't about the words he used, it was just that I didn't understand the culture. I didn't understand when he says where you're from, it had nothing to do with me. And I've stuck with it. I still take Korean lessons to this day. My parents think that I don't need to because they think my Korean's good enough. But I want to get professional in the language, which means that I need to spend time. And I've been living in Korea for the past few years and making slow progress. And if that's where I stopped, I probably would still feel very insecure about my language. I would still feel kind of not quite Korean, not quite American, somewhere in between. And I think this is the awkward phase that we all know if we've lived in another country. But there is a third phase. There is another phase you can emerge out to. And I actually got there with Chinese. I didn't start learning Chinese until I was 21, which is pretty late. I actually had a lot of teachers tell me, there's no point to learn Chinese with that old because you're not going to learn it. It's too difficult of a language. But I started studying. I got a teacher. At first, I was studying for 4 hours every single day. And then I ended up doing a master's degree in China. My proudest moment was when I was 26. I was in a taxi in Hangzhou. And my taxi driver asked me, hey, so where are you from? And I said, oh, I am Korean, but I was born in America, and I'm here studying Chinese in Hangzhou. And he said, again, he looked confused. He was surprised. And he said, wait, so you're not Chinese? I thought you were like from Hong Kong or something. And I was like, oh, no, yeah, I'm just Korean. And he said, why did you come to China? If you're American and Korean, those are rich countries. Why did you bother coming to China and learning Chinese? And I explained to him, no, I love the food, I love the culture, I love the history. There's so much to learn. I'm having a really wonderful life in China. The taxi driver smiled and he said, 你中文真棒, right? Your Chinese is good. And we had a long chat. And I love that moment because to me, that's the real purpose of learning a language, right? It's not to get a good grade, not to impress my parents. It's purely because I wanted to connect with this country and this culture. And once I got to that level, it took me a few years, I was able to connect with people. I was able to chat with my taxi driver. And I ended up living in China for 8 years. So when I think about the students in the audience, you're going to go through some of these challenges. I'm sure when you first started at this school, it was challenging, right? You have all these foreign teachers speaking and teaching in a language you're not comfortable with. That makes sense. And of course, you have your exams, you need to get into university. That's very stressful, so that makes sense too. But the moment that you leave China and you live in another country, you can look at it in two ways. One way to look at it is, this is awful, right? I have to live in a new country. I don't know how things work. I need to make new friends. I'm going to be constantly uncomfortable. And that's true, right? There's no denying that that's part of the process. But there's another way to look at it, which is the soulful way to look at it, right? Again, to have another language, to possess a second soul. So start cultivating your soul. And my advice to you on that, I'm not a language learning expert, but what I found is that you need to get to that level. We call it in psychology the zone of proximal development. And that's just a fancy term for saying you need to be just enough in your comfort zone where you get encouraged, you get praised. When the taxi driver tells me that my Chinese is good, I feel good. I start to learn that learning a language is a positive thing. I get rewarded. I think that should be about 80%. I think that's true in a lot of different subjects. You want about 80% of positive reinforcement. So don't forget that learning a language should be fun. It should be a nice thing. And then the 20% is you're getting outside of your comfort zone, right? This is the challenging aspect of learning a language. This is learning new words, making mistakes, embarrassing yourself. And every time you do that, remember that that's not you. That's not your fault, okay? That's just part of the process of learning. The more you make those mistakes, the better you're going to learn. You'll learn faster. You'll get to this place of getting more comfortable, of getting that positive reinforcement. And then one day, if you do that for a few years, someday you're going to wake up, you're going to have a nice conversation with your taxi driver. You're going to make friends with your neighbor. And it's possible, unlike me when I was young and I had to choose, am I American or Korean, you're going to have the choice of being both Chinese and an English speaker. And you get to maybe learn a third language, right? And so that's why the topic of my talk is how I got 3 souls, English, Korean, and Chinese. But I want to actually expand the definition of that just one step further. So we have languages. Of course, that's the most obvious form of a soul, right? How we feel somebody's essence. And if you learn a few languages, you can get a few. But language doesn't necessarily need to be based on the country. You can learn a new language depending on your field, on your studies, your major, even in an activity. So, for example, I am a psychology major, right? And as I'm talking about the zone of proximal development, or I talk about how loss aversion bias leads to the paradox of choice, right? These are all simple English words. And if you study psychology, you know exactly what I'm talking about. And if you haven't studied psychology, it doesn't make any sense, right? So no matter what field you enter, you're also required to learn that new language. And the moment that you feel comfortable in that language, it takes a few years, you'll be an expert in psychology. And then think about something like sports. I'm an avid rock climber. I love going outside and climbing. And if I tell you that, recently was in Oaxaca doing an outdoor V6, and the crux was going from a crimp into a dyno. Again, I'm speaking English, but if you're a climber, you really understand what I'm talking about. You understand how your body moves in each of those steps. And I love that language, the language of rock climbers. They're a community of people who are passionate about challenging the limits of their body. And what's cool about rock climbing is I can be in other countries. When I travel to Japan, when I'm in Mexico, I get to do rock climbing. Even if I don't speak the local language, we have that language of sport. And finally, we have languages like lifestyles. You could live in different English-speaking countries and have a totally different experience. And for me, I spent almost 4 months living in the Bahamas, the Caribbean nation. And what I did there was every morning at 6:30, wake up, go for a run with the people in my school. We would swim in the ocean every single day. And that's a lifestyle. And that's something I share, a deep bond I share with the other students from that school. That's a deep part of my soul. That's part of what makes me who I am. It's what makes me feel alive. So every time you go to a new country, you can collect that new soul, whether that's a language or an interest, a hobby, a subject. You can collect those souls. So I'll end my talk with this. Right now, today, you're sitting here in the audience. You probably have at least one soul, I hope, and then you're working on your second. You're learning a second language. You're in this international environment. And then when you graduate, you're allowed to collect more souls. You're allowed to make your life more multidimensional, more rich. So my challenge to you is come back to me in 10 years. Come back with like 100 souls. Let's see how many you can collect. Thank you, everybody. That's my talk. 谢谢大家。